What if a cold morning and a critical decision reshaped the future of space exploration forever?
Hey, I'm Garrett, feeling curious today and ready to explore space history.
And I'm Leah, thrilled to dive into today's gripping topic. Welcome to Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett. Today we're looking at the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, how it happened, why it mattered, and what it changed.
So, quick personal share. I didn't watch Challenger live since, I was a kid years later. But I remember a rainy day in elementary school when a teacher rolled in the TV and played the launch and the news coverage. That white plume splitting in the sky just froze me. I had this mix of wonder and dread, like watching something beautiful go sideways in an instant. And the part that stuck was hearing about Krista McAuliffe, the teacher on board. As a kid, it made space feel close to the classroom, which is maybe why the loss hit so hard. It felt personal, like a lesson that got interrupted mid-sentence.
I had a similar moment later on, seeing the replay. I remember thinking about how ordinary that morning must have felt for so many people watching. Then, everything changes in seconds. It reminded me that exploration is brave and also unforgiving when systems fail. All right, let's set the scene for what this mission was and what went wrong. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster happened in January 1986. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart and all 7 crew members were lost. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, and payload specialists Gregory Jarvis and Krista McAuliffe. The mission was designated STS-51L, and it was meant to deploy a communications satellite called TDRS-B and do observations related to Halley's Comet using a small free-flying satellite. It was supposed to be a showcase of science, education, and shuttle versatility.
Mechanically, here's the quick tour. The shuttle stack had 3 big pieces: the orbiter, which is the winged spaceplane carrying the crew, the external tank, or ET, that held liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen for the shuttle's main engines, and 2 solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, providing the kick at liftoff. The SRBs are like giant firecrackers with guidance. They burn hard for about 2 minutes, then drop off to be recovered from the Atlantic. The problem lived inside one of those boosters at a seam called a field joint. That joint used rubber seals called O-rings to keep scorching hot gases from leaking out.
Think of an O-ring like the gasket on a car's engine, or the rubber ring in a garden hose connector. If the gasket is stiff or not seated right, water leaks. In the booster, it's not water, it's insanely hot, high-pressure gas. If that leaks, it's catastrophic. On that cold morning, the O-rings were less flexible, or in plain terms, they were stiff and slow to squish into place. The joint also tended to rotate slightly under pressure, which could pull the seal out of its happy spot right when you needed it most. That combination set up a failure chain.
One more basic term that will pop up. You'll hear max Q, which means the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle, sort of the roughest air forces during ascent. If a seal is already marginal, max Q can be the worst time to test its strength. Okay, now let's rewind and look at how the warning signs piled up before that day. From the early days, engineers had concerns about the joints. In the late 1970s, tests showed those joints could rotate a bit under pressure. That rotation reduces the squeeze on the O-rings, and instead of the ring being pressed into the gap to seal, it could get tugged away. Not ideal. There were suggestions like adding shims to limit that rotation, but they didn't get implemented. The shuttle moved forward toward operations. By 1981, they were already seeing erosion on O-rings after flights, which is like finding your car gasket partly burned after a drive. It should have been headline news in the program.
And by 1982, NASA's critical items list, which is the master list of things that, if they fail, you can lose the crew or the vehicle, was updated to say the SRB O-rings were criticality 1. That means if they fail, there's no reliable backup. Before that, they were labeled 1R, which suggested a backup existed, but evidence showed the secondary O-ring probably wouldn't save the day if the joint rotated. That's a huge deal. It's basically saying, this seal is single-point failure territory.
Morton Thiokol, the company that built the SRBs, had engineers like Roger Boisjoli raising big red flags. Boisjoli, an O-ring specialist, argued that the design was not reliable, especially in the cold. Through 1984 and 1985, flights kept showing blow-by, which is soot or hot gas getting past the primary O-ring. In one case, the secondary O-ring even showed erosion. If you see that pattern repeatedly, it's not a fluke, it's a system talking to you.
Here's where culture comes in. The Rogers Commission later called it normalization of deviance. That's when you see a risky anomaly again and again, but since nothing catastrophic happens, it starts to feel acceptable. Like if your smoke alarm chirps occasionally and you get used to it, even though it's warning you. In 1985, O-ring erosion happened on most flights. That should have been a stop sign. Instead, it became a yield sign.
By mid-1985, Thiokol had begun designing a better joint with a larger O-ring and features to reduce that rotation. But new hardware wasn't on the vehicle yet. So Challenger in January 1986 still had the older configuration, heading into a forecast cold snap. And it wasn't just chilly, it was record cold for a shuttle launch morning.
The night before the January 1986 launch, they held a teleconference among Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and Morton Thiokol in Utah. Lawrence Mulloy, who managed the SRB program at NASA's Marshall Center, was on the NASA side. On the contractor side were folks like Joe Kilminster, a senior executive at Thiokol, and Robert Lund, the vice president of engineering. Thiokol's engineers, including Boisjoli, argued for a no-go below certain temperatures because O-rings stiffen and respond slowly in the cold. They said, in essence, we don't have data showing it's safe at these temps.
Initially, Thiokol recommended delaying. Then there was a management caucus on the contractor side. They stepped away, came back, and reversed to a go. Alan McDonald, Thiokol's site director at Kennedy, refused to personally sign the launch recommendation. He didn't think it was safe. Joe Kilminster signed and faxed it instead. Mulloy then told Arnold Aldrich, who led the mission management team at NASA, that they had to go. But crucially, Aldrich wasn't told about the depth of the O-ring debate. That missing context mattered a lot.
Why would management change the recommendation after the engineers spoke up? I mean, that's the moment to be cautious. Why flip it?
Short version. They were balancing schedule pressure, a belief that previous erosions hadn't caused a disaster, and the lack of cold weather test data that definitively said, do not fly. In complex organizations, ambiguity can get interpreted as permission. Add to that the teacher in space spotlight and media ribbing after earlier scrubs. It created a subtle push to avoid yet another delay. Not an excuse, but a window into the mindset.
On the morning of the launch, the ICE team at Kennedy walked the pad and recorded how cold the hardware was. That wasn't part of the formal launch rules, oddly, so there was no automatic stop at a low SRB temperature. There was also visible ice on structures. Rockwell, the prime contractor for the orbiter, had concerns. A senior Rockwell figure, Rocco Petrone, urged caution, worried that ice could break off and damage the orbiter's heat tiles. After back and forth, NASA inserted a 1-hour delay for more melting and reinspection, then pressed on.
Liftoff. At T plus less than 4 seconds, multiple puffs of dark smoke came from the right booster's aft field joint. That smoke is the telltale of hot gas sneaking by the primary O-ring. Then, something counterintuitive happened. Molten aluminum oxide from the propellant appeared to form a temporary plug. Think of it like a gritty scab covering a cut. It held for almost a minute while the shuttle accelerated through changing winds.
As they climbed, the vehicle encountered wind shear. That means the air was changing direction and speed with altitude, still within design limits, but it added stress. Around T plus 58 seconds, cameras caught a bright plume near that right booster joint. The plug likely broke apart under the loads near max Q, and hot gases began burning through the joint. The right booster's internal pressure dipped. That's like a pressure gauge telling you there's a leak.
The shuttle's main engines, highly steerable, gimbaled to fight the asymmetric thrust, but now the flame was impinging on the external tank. The liquid hydrogen tank's pressure started dropping. That was the first hint the tank was being compromised. At around 73 seconds, Capcom Richard Covey, the astronaut on the radio loop, called, "Go at throttle up," and Commander Scobie answered. Those were the last clear words. Seconds later, the right booster pulled loose at its aft attached strut. The external tank structure failed. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen mixed and ignited in a rapid, violent event. The orbiter was ripped apart by the airloads. It wasn't built to survive such forces at that speed.
One of the last recorded words from the crew was pilot Michael Smith saying, "Uh-oh." After the breakup, both boosters flew on unguided until the range safety officer sent destruct commands. Meanwhile, the crew cabin separated largely intact and followed a high arc before falling to the ocean. Impact forces were far beyond human survivability.
On the ground, Mission Control heard a burst of static, then nothing. NASA Public Affairs Officer Steve Nesbitt said, obviously a major malfunction. Flight Director Jay Green locked the control room down to preserve data, and recovery operations spun up across the Atlantic. That afternoon, President Ronald Reagan postponed the State of the Union and addressed the nation, honoring the crew. The Navy, Air Force, and contractor teams began a months-long search, eventually finding critical pieces, including the failed right booster joint segment. That physical evidence confirmed the O-ring burn-through story we just walked through.
Afterwards, the investigation called the Rogers Commission criticized NASA's decision-making culture. They flagged the normalization of deviance, the communication breakdown that kept upper management from hearing the full O-ring debate, and the acceptance of risk without sufficient data. In response, NASA redesigned the booster joints, created an Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance to add independent oversight, and shifted routine satellite launches to expendable rockets, so astronauts wouldn't be riding shotgun for cargo that didn't need humans. Crews later wore pressurized suits for ascent and re-entry, not a cure-all, but an important layer of protection.
There's a lasting, tough question people still ask. What exactly happened to the crew in those seconds and minutes after the breakup? The timing and cause of death can't be known for sure. Some evidence suggests possible actions after breakup, like personal egress air packs, PEEPs, being activated. Those packs are basically small bottles of breathable air for getting out after landing. They don't pressurize the cabin. And several lever-locked switches in the cockpit were found moved, which likely means someone reached for procedures.
Dr. Joseph Kerwin, a physician astronaut who led the crew survival study, wrote that while some crew might have been conscious for a time, the ocean impact forces were unsurvivable. And without hard proof the cabin stayed pressurized, we can't say consciousness lasted or that life support was intact. It's heartbreaking either way. For me, the responsible posture is to say, we don't know. We honor the courage without speculating beyond the evidence.
I hear you. I also think the PEEP use and those moved switches are meaningful. They speak to training and composure. Someone tried to stabilize systems. It suggests at least brief awareness after separation. That doesn't change the final outcome, but to me, it shows the crew was doing what astronauts do, working the problem until the very end.
That's fair. My only caution is that PEEPs provide air, not pressure, so they wouldn't protect against high-altitude depressurization. And without pressure, even with air to breathe, you can lose consciousness quickly at those altitudes. So I lean toward humility in the face of incomplete data. Either way, their professionalism under impossible conditions is clear.
On the cultural side, this was one of those moments everyone remembers. CNN carried the launch live, and because Krista McAuliffe was a teacher planning to give lessons from orbit, a lot of classrooms were tuned in. That collective shock became part of the national memory. Decades later, in 2022, a large Challenger fragment was found off the Florida coast and documented on a History Channel project. NASA confirmed it. It's a reminder that the ocean still holds parts of that story.
Okay, let's try a careful what-if scenario. What if NASA had delayed the launch until the weather warmed up, respecting the temperature threshold the engineers wanted? If the O-rings had the right flexibility, the primary might have sealed properly at ignition. No early blow-by, no fragile plug, no burn-through. That alone could have averted the chain we described.
Imagine that world. Challenger completes the mission. TDRSB deploys, Halley's Comet observations go off, and a generation of kids watches a teacher float in microgravity and send lessons back to Earth. That's a different narrative arc. The program would still need a joint redesign because the risk data were real, but the fix might have happened without a tragedy as the trigger. Maybe we'd remember STS-51L for education and a clean deployment rather than a national trauma.
And if that delay had happened, maybe the organization would have internalized a key principle earlier. When data are ambiguous in a life-critical area, waiting is wisdom. Perhaps the safety office gains teeth sooner. Perhaps launch rules explicitly include SRB temperature. I can see a culture that's less rushed, more willing to scrub and regroup. We can't know for sure, but it's a powerful reminder that patience can be a safety tool.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Stay curious and keep learning with us. Until next time.